We're moving on to our final presentation by Vittoria Federici, who is a manager at the content policy group at Facebook in London. Her work includes writing global policies on what users can share on Facebook. And I think, from what I understand of her work, practically daily, she deals with issues like the scope of free speech, the strategies for fighting hate speech, and how to contrast violent extremism on Facebook. So I think we'll all be particularly interested in seeing how Facebook actually deals with this question in day-to-day context. So Victoria, thank you, and please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mattia. Good morning, everyone. First of all, I hope you can see my presentation. I can't see anyone, so Mattia, yes?
Yeah, perfect.
Fantastic. So as Mattia said, my name is Vittoria Federici, and I'm a manager on the Facebook content policy team, which is the team that basically writes the rules about what is and is not allowed on Facebook and Instagram. I've been in this role for 3 years now. I'm based in London, and traditionally I've been covering the Europe, Middle East, and Africa region. Apologies, there's my son in the background having a bit of a cry. But today I will talk about Facebook's approach to fighting online hate speech. I'll be sharing more detail about our community standards, what they cover, and how these are developed and how they're enforced. So I always think it's worth starting with a quick reminder of the scale at which Facebook operates. We currently serve a community of over 2 billion people around the world, and these people choose to share billions of pieces of content on the platform every day. And every week we receive millions of reports from the Facebook community related to things that they believe should not be on our platform. So one of the biggest challenges we face, and something that we do take very, very seriously, is deciding what content stays up and what content has to come down. And this really involves striking the balance between the ideal of giving people a voice with the very practical reality of keeping them safe on our platforms. So on the surface, many believe that content moderation is just about our content reviewers and the process of reviewing reported content. But at Facebook scale, content review actually requires the work and partnership of multiple teams and subject matter experts across policy, product, and operations. And these teams work together to address enforcement with the thought and skill that a project of this complexity and scale requires. So let me introduce the content policy team, which is my team. And that's the team responsible for developing and writing our community standards. We are based in 11 offices around the world, spanning every time zone. And this team is made up of over 200 people, including subject matter experts on issues like terrorism, hate speech, of course, and child safety. But just to say that it's a very diverse group of people. Then we have community integrity, which is the team that builds products to keep people safe and secure. They do this in two ways. They build the user experience that enables people to do things like reporting harmful content, to send feedback, to appeal decisions. And then they also develop the artificial intelligence algorithms that detect and surface harmful content, and the technology that basically takes down the content automatically or escalates it to a human reviewer for review. And this team includes engineering, data science, product, program management, and data engineering. And then we have global operations, and this is the team that enforces our community standards through human review. And this team includes about 15,000 content reviewers across the globe and in every major time zone. And these include native language speakers in over 50 languages, because we know that it often takes a native speaker to understand the true meaning of certain words and the context in which they are shared. And the team also includes experts in areas like child safety, hate speech, counterterrorism, and so on. But it's important to understand that all of these teams have to work in concert together. One area cannot support the Facebook community without the help of the others. And in the last few years, we have more than quadrupled the number of people working on safety and security, and we now have over 40,000 working in this space. So as I said, we have more than 2 billion people using our services to share and connect across countries, cultures, and languages, and ensuring that people can do this freely but also safely is critically important to us, and that's why we have these community standards which determine what is and is not allowed on the platform. And these rules are applied uniformly across Facebook and Instagram as well, although we call them our community guidelines on Instagram. So these rules are split into 7 pillars, and they cover 26 specific areas, from bullying and harassment and hate speech to graphic violence and credible threats, all the way to things like fake accounts, fraud, and impersonation. A key aspect of these policies is that they are global, to reflect the fact that our services are global. So it's important to understand that we have a single set of community standards that apply equally to everyone who uses Facebook or Instagram, whether you're sitting in Italy, Ghana, or the US. Because these policies are global, they do not and are not intended to reflect or cover local laws. Although, since they are designed to prevent harm, they do sometimes overlap with local laws in a number of areas. But we do have a completely separate system for users to report content that they believe violates the law, and I will touch on this a bit later. But I just want to note that it's really tough to create a set of policies to serve a community as large and diverse as ours. Oftentimes what may be acceptable in one part of the world may not be acceptable in another. And so this means that we are constantly balancing and reweighing and iterating these policies to make sure that they land in the right place and that they strike the right balance between safety on the one hand and expression on the other. So at the core of all of our policies, we have 5 key values. The first one is voice, which for us is absolutely paramount. We believe that freedom of expression is a fundamental human right, and the goal of our community standards, but our services more broadly, is really to create a place for expression and to give people voice. So we want people to be able to talk openly about the issues that matter to them, even if some may disagree or find them objectionable. Which is why we do not remove posts or content just because some people don't like them. In fact, we really believe that building community and sort of bringing people closer together actually depends on people's ability to share diverse views. And this is, especially important when it comes to things like political speech, for instance, which sits at the very heart of freedom of expression. So we're focused on creating services which give people a voice, no matter what your political views may be, which candidates or parties you support, or which causes you advocate for. That's why our policies apply equally to everyone on Facebook and Instagram across the political spectrum. But while our commitment to free expression is paramount, we recognize that the internet creates new and increased opportunities for abuse. And so for this reason, we do limit expression, but only when there is a risk of harm, and specifically in relation to one or more of our other values, so authenticity, safety, privacy, and dignity. So for example, posts that contain, a credible threat of violence are perhaps the most obvious instances where, restricting speech is necessary to prevent harm. But also, we don't allow hate speech based on things like race, religion, or sexuality, because it does create an environment of intimidation and exclusion, which in some cases may have dangerous offline implications as well. We also don't allow content which could, financially endanger people through scams, or content which violates people's personal privacy. But, the tension between these values, between, freedom of expression and freedom from fear, between privacy and safety, are very complicated philosophical questions, which, many organizations grapple with, as there rarely are, universal answers to provide clarity on these things. So as I said, it's difficult to draw these lines, and often we face criticism from, across the political spectrum for the kinds of decisions that we make, both from people who think that we take down too much content, but also from people who don't think that we take down enough. But we do see that as a useful signal that we're not leaning too far in any one direction. So the content policy team, my team, develops the policies and is tasked with drawing these lines. Our work is never done because our community standards are essentially a living document, meaning that we are constantly evolving these policies to keep pace with changing language and online behaviors. In the last year alone, we updated our hate speech policy to prohibit any content that denies or distorts the Holocaust. We expanded our dangerous individuals and organizations policies to address new phenomena like QAnon. We developed our policies to combat harmful COVID-19 misinformation, and so on and so forth. Because drawing these lines on what is and is not acceptable is really difficult and challenging, we do work closely with hundreds of organizations and experts outside the company based across the globe to make sure that we are drawing the lines in the right places. Now, here is a very simplified diagram of how this process works and how we acquire insight into the policy process from internal and external experts. So every 2 weeks, we host an internal meeting called the Policy Forum, in which we bring experts from across the company to talk about potential policy changes. In that meeting, a member of the content policy team can introduce a content issue that they would like to address. Now, there's many reasons why we may draft a new policy or revise an existing one. This could be based on feedback from a group of external stakeholders, or a change that we've witnessed in the way that people behave on the platforms, or an issue flagged by our content reviewers related to how an existing rule is being enforced. Once the issue is raised in that meeting, we'll then convene working groups with internal teams across the company, and then external experts who work on this issue, to explore what a policy change might look like. Depending on the complexity of the subject, working groups may last a couple of weeks, a couple of months, or even a year. It really depends. Based on the input received and the research that we have completed, the content policy team will then put together a policy recommendation, which will include a number of different policy options. And these will be thoroughly sort of discussed and debated at the policy forum. At the end of that discussion, the policy forum can then elect to approve the recommendation, and so change the policies or request further refinements, in which case, the whole process repeats itself from the beginning. But I want to stress that policy development at Facebook is never really complete. The way people use the platform changes, as do social norms. And so our policy development really endeavors to keep pace with that change. So as I try to convey, policy development at Facebook is a very deliberative and collaborative process, which does involve work with a wide range of internal groups in a variety of different time zones, but also a large number of external organizations and experts who help us ensure that our policies land in the right place. And this includes academics, local NGOs, safety organizations, law enforcement, human rights activists, and many, many others. Essentially, anyone who has an interest in our policies or is directly impacted by them. But this is to stress that we never develop these policies in a vacuum. We always make sure to reach out to experts in different fields to receive their input and feedback, and to ensure that we're making informed decisions about difficult policy issues. So let's talk about our hate speech policy. We do not allow hate speech on Facebook because it does create an environment of intimidation and exclusion, and in some cases, it may promote real-world violence. So we define hate speech as attacks on an individual or group based on a protected characteristic. And this includes things like race, ethnicity, national origin, religious affiliation, sexual orientation, caste, sex, gender identity, and serious disease or disability. Our policies apply to hate speech which is targeted at a person or a group of people, not an entity, ideology, or institution. For example, we do not allow people to say, "I hate Christians," as that refers to a group of people. However, we do allow people to say something like, "I hate Christianity," because that refers to a religious ideology. So what do we mean by an attack? We mean any violent speech or support for death or harm, dehumanizing speech, cursing and statements of inferiority, contempt, or disgust, as well as calls for exclusion. As Claudia explained before, hate speech can be highly contextual, which does present challenges in enforcing our policies at scale. So, for example, we recognize that people sometimes share content that includes someone else's hate speech to condemn it or raise awareness. In other cases, speech that might otherwise violate our standards can be used self-referentially or in an empowering way. So our policy is designed to allow room for these types of speech, but we require people to clearly indicate their intent. If the intention is unclear, then we may remove content. So in addition to the protected characteristics that I listed earlier, we also protect refugees, migrants, immigrants, and asylum seekers from the most severe attacks. Though we do allow commentary and criticism of things like immigration policies. So, for instance, we would leave this post up on Facebook. Why? Because immigration is a very hot political issue all around the world. And we want Facebook to be a place where people can discuss key issues. So when it comes to immigration, what we would call exclusionary speech is naturally a very central part to the discourse, as the fundamental question around immigration is whether to let people in or out. And so we would allow this kind of speech around immigrants. Having said that, if the speech became violent or dehumanizing, for example, calling immigrants filth or comparing immigrants to violent criminals or calling for violence against them, then we would absolutely remove that. So by contrast, we would take this post down because under our hate speech policy, immigrants are protected from what we define as violent and dehumanizing speech. So our policies are only as good as our enforcement, and we do use a combination of user reports from our community, review by our teams, and technology to identify and review content against our standards. So anyone can report something to us if they think it breaks our rules using the reporting tools that we have across Facebook and Instagram. And we do encourage people to report content to us because when someone shares something that goes against our rules, we definitely want to hear about it. Just one report is enough for us to take down content if it violates our policies. We do not remove content just because it has been reported a certain number of times. Of course, not everything that people find offensive or upsetting will violate our policies. And so we also offer ways for people to customize and control what they see by unfollowing, by blocking, snoozing people, hiding posts, pages and accounts. So in response to the question that I received earlier, we're very much in favor of these controls, and we do offer a number of self-remediation tools for users on both Facebook and Instagram. In addition to user reports, we're also increasingly relying now on artificial intelligence to actually detect violating content on Facebook and Instagram before people see it and report it to us. in some cases, our technology is confident enough that a piece of content actually violates our standards, that it will also delete it automatically. If, for example, it is identical to something that we have removed before for breaking our rules, such as a piece of terrorist content, for example, or maybe something related to nudity. However, while our technology has come a long way, there's still many cases in which a trained human reviewer is absolutely critical to enforcing our standards fairly and accurately, especially in cases where the context surrounding a piece of content is crucial. Hate speech is a very good example. As we said, hate speech is highly contextual. Slurs can be used to attack someone, or they can be used in a self-referential manner, or they can be shared to raise awareness of an attack. So a human reviewer is often needed to help make this determination and understand the context around the content. So I just want to stress that in the case of hate speech, we do use a combination of human review and automation. So now we have, as I said before, over 40,000 people working in safety and security at Facebook, of which about 15,000 are content reviewers. And these teams are based around the world in every major time zone. And collectively, they review content 24/7 in over 50 languages. As well as local language capability, which is really important, we also make a point to hire people with the necessary cultural context for the markets in which we operate. As we understand, it often takes a local to understand the specific cultural or political climate in which a post is shared. So our reviewers undergo extensive training when they join and throughout their time working for Facebook to ensure the decisions they make are both accurate and consistent across the globe. And we also carry out our own proactive audits where we conduct re-reviews that help us figure out if we're getting it right. But despite these steps, we know that mistakes do happen. And while we're constantly working to make sure that they happen less, we also have an appeals system so that people can tell us when they think we've gotten something wrong so that we can have a second look. And I'll briefly talk about this now. So yeah, we know that we don't always get it right and when we decide to take something down. And if a user's content was taken down and they think it doesn't go against our community standards, then they can request review in most circumstances. And when a user does this, when they request a review, we'll take a second look at the decision that we made. Once they ask us to take a second look, their content will be reviewed again by Facebook, usually within 24 hours. And if we find that we've made a mistake, we will let them know and their post, photo, video content will be restored. But I just want to acknowledge that we do have fewer reviewers available right now because of the COVID pandemic, and we're trying hard to prioritize reviewing content with the most potential for harm. And this means that you may see the option to disagree with a decision instead of requesting review. And when someone disagrees with a decision, we may not be able to follow up with them, but their feedback helps us do better in the future. So if someone requests a review and still doesn't agree with our decision, then they may be able to appeal to the oversight board. And I will say more about this in a few slides. So for a long time, we heard from our partners and our community that they wanted a better sense about how well we were doing at enforcing our policies and at catching harmful content. So in mid-2017, we actually published our first community standards enforcement report, which shares numbers on the content that we were seeing and catching that violated our community standards. This is very much a work in progress as we continue to refine our methodology. But since that first report 3 years ago, we've more than doubled the number of policies that we report on, and we've increased the frequency of reports from half yearly to quarterly. And we really believe that increased transparency tends to lead to increased accountability and responsibility. So publishing this data should help us improve faster. So we publish 3 data sets within the Community Standards Enforcement Report. The first one is prevalence. So how prevalent are violations on Facebook and Instagram? In other words, how much of the violating content was seen by someone on the platform? And this is a really, really important number because we want that to be as low as possible. Secondly, how much content do we take action on, or how many pieces of content that violated a specific policy did we take down in that quarter? And thirdly, how much violating content do we find before users report it? What percentage of the content we took down did we find proactively before anyone reported it to us? And this is also a very important number as we work to improve our proactive detection technologies that will allow us to get better and faster at taking down violating content without having to wait for it to be reported by a user. So as our most recent community standards enforcement report showed, we're finding and removing more hate speech on our platforms than ever before. And more importantly, people are seeing less of it overall. This is what we call prevalence. As I said, prevalence measures what percentage of views on Facebook came from content that violates our policies, essentially how many times people see violating content on our platform. And we think this is the most important metric because it measures what we miss and ends up being seen by people. Now, the prevalence of hate speech on Facebook is now 0.05% of content viewed and is down by almost 50% in the last 3 quarters. In other words, for every 10,000 pieces of content viewed, only 5 of those are pieces of content that might be considered hateful. So we use technology to reduce the prevalence of hate speech in several ways. It helps us to proactively detect it, to route it to our reviewers, and to remove it when it violates our policies. It also allows us to reduce the distribution of likely violating content. And all of these tools working together is what makes an impact on this prevalence number. But what will never, we'll never take down 100% of hate speech. But we report on this to show how much hate speech we actually missed, so that we continue to improve. Other highlights from the latest transparency report are that 97.6% of hate speech taken down from Facebook was spotted by our automated systems before any human flagged it to us. And this is up from 94% last year and 80.5% in late 2019. More importantly, this is up from 24% in late 2017. A pace of improvement that we rarely see in technologies being deployed on such a scale. So in addition to our community standards enforcement report, we also publish twice a year a report on how we respond to government requests for data or content restrictions. As mentioned earlier, our community standards are developed for a global user base and are not intended to cover all local laws. So we rely on governments and local law enforcement to tell us if they think that something on Facebook or Instagram violates local laws. And we have a robust process for reviewing these reports that allege that content on Facebook violates local laws. So if we find that a piece of content does indeed violate the law, we may make it unavailable in the relevant country or territory. And then we publish the requests in our biannual transparency report, which breaks down these requests country by country. So in addition to having strong policies and enforcement, we also believe there is huge value in empowering counter narratives. And I mean, there's no doubt that the best remedy to bad speech is positive speech. And our community uses our platform to speak out against hatred and to raise up moderate voices in response to extremist ones. Online extremism can only really be tackled with a strong partnership between policymakers, civil society, academia, and companies. And so we work closely with experts and support counter-speech initiatives. We support a variety of initiatives, including commissioning research on what makes counter-speech effective, training NGOs about best counter-speech practices, as well as partnering with other organizations to help amplify the voices of those on the ground. Now, while we have always taken advice from experts on how to best keep our platform safe, until recently we have made the final decisions about what should be allowed on our platforms and what should be removed. And these decisions often are not easy to make. Most judgments are not obvious or uncontroversial outcomes, and yet many of them have significant implications for free expression. So that is why in 2018, Mark Zuckerberg said that Facebook should not make so many important decisions about free expression and safety on our own. And he outlined a vision for a new chapter in content governance and enforcement. And this included a vision of an external board, so people could appeal the content decisions that we made to an independent body whose decisions would be completely separate from Facebook and binding. And so over the last 2 years, we've worked to establish this board, and it has now become operational. And this board is made up of experts across the globe, including humanitarian activists, law professors, former newspaper editors, a former prime minister, and a Nobel laureate. So if your content is removed from Facebook or Instagram and you've exhausted your appeals with Facebook or Instagram, you will be able to appeal your case to this body, which, as I said, is completely separate from Facebook. And they will have the power to overrule the decision that we made and to recommend changes or additions to our policies as well. And as many of you may know, the board has already started to hear and take decisions on cases, and it selected its first cases in December 2020 and published its first decisions at the beginning of this year. And the board's first rulings were a very significant moment for content regulation and accountability, marking the first time that an independent body was, reviewing a private social media company's content decisions at that company's request. And along with these decisions, which have already been implemented, the board also gives us recommendations tied to content policy and content moderation more broadly. And overall, we believe that the board included some very important suggestions that we will take to heart, and their recommendations will have a lasting impact on how we structure our policies. And we really look forward to continuing to receive the board's decisions in the months and years to come. So while the board is a critical step in building accountability and oversight into what we do, the board isn't going to solve every problem, and it doesn't really replace the need for responsible regulation. And that's why since 2018, we've also consistently called for updated regulation in this space, because we agree that it would be better if these decisions were made according to democratically accountable legal frameworks. Designing these rules will be a very complex challenge. Any new rules will need to protect freedom of expression and the incredible benefits the internet has brought without undermining people's safety. The key challenge is, how do you impose restrictions on social media companies and make them more accountable for removing harmful content, but also ensure that they don't just start removing anything remotely close to the line and impinge on free expression, as it was already noted earlier. So as I've said before, when we released our community standards enforcement report, we think the data we share can help inform that conversation, because they show our performance and our progress in these areas. And we think that good regulation could create a standard like that across the entire industry. We've actually published a white paper last year on content regulation, kind of highlighting the challenges in this area and some of the things like transparency standards, which we think regulation should start by focusing on, which I would encourage everyone to read if you have the time or interest. So I think this is a good place for me to end. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you to Roma for organizing this conference. I'm very sorry, but I'm afraid I won't be able to attend the upcoming discussion and Q&A, as I have another engagement and I'm 20 minutes late. But nonetheless, I'm very glad that I was able to share this information with this audience, and hopefully you found this useful and it helped address some of the queries that you have around how Facebook moderates hate speech. Thank you again. It was a pleasure to be a part of this.